woman behind the counter didn't even try to hide it. She looked at the key sitting on her desk, looked back up at the man standing in front of her, and she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the kind you cover with your hand. The kind that starts in the belly and rolls out before you can catch it. The kind that says everything about what she thinks of you without a single word. And the man standing there, 6'1", with shoulders built from 23 years of hauling line on Navy destroyers, just stood there and took it, because what was he going to say? The key was rusted so bad you could barely see the teeth. The slip of paper next to it had an address, written in handwriting he barely recognized, smudged at the edges like whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. Or maybe their hands had been shaking. That was all he had. That was everything his dead father left him. A key that looked like it had been sitting in a coffee can for 30 years, and an address nobody in that bank had ever heard of. The branch manager walked over, glanced at the key, glanced at the paper, and told him there was nothing they could do. Told him whatever lock that key opened, it wasn't their problem. Told him with that particular kind of small-town politeness that carries a blade inside it, that he might want to try a locksmith instead of a financial institution. Marcus Tanner picked up the key, picked up the paper, and walked out of that bank without saying a word. His German Shepherd, Gunner, was sitting right where he'd left him, ears up, watching the door like he'd been counting the seconds. Marcus knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears, and said the only honest thing he could think of. "Well, buddy, that one about as good as everything else." What nobody in that bank knew, what nobody in that entire town would have believed if you'd told them, was that the rusted key they just laughed at would turn out to be worth more than every dollar sitting in every account behind that counter. And the man they dismissed would be the one to prove it. But not alone, never alone, because the dog sitting next to him on that sidewalk was about to lead him somewhere none of them could have imagined. Marcus Tanner spent 23 years in the United States Navy. He enlisted at 18 because his mother told him it was either the military or the door, and she meant it. She was a hard woman, Helen Tanner, the kind who kept the house spotless and the curtains drawn and never talked about the man who left when Marcus was 4 years old. Roy Tanner, that was his father's name. And growing up, Marcus heard it spoken exactly two ways. With bitterness from his mother, who said Roy was a coward and a deadbeat who walked out on his family because he couldn't handle responsibility. And with a shrug from the aunts and uncles who said Roy was always a little off, always tinkering with things in the garage instead of holding down a real job, always chasing some idea that was never going to pan out. By the time Marcus was old enough to form his own opinion, he'd already decided he didn't need one. His father left. That was the whole story. There was nothing else to know. So Marcus joined the Navy, and the Navy gave him the structure his childhood never did. He served on 3 destroyers, made Chief Petty Officer, deployed to the Gulf twice. The first deployment, he was 24 years old and convinced he was invincible. The second, he was 36 and knew better. But he went anyway, because the Navy was the only family that hadn't let him down yet. Between deployments, he lived in base housing and ate at the mess, and spent his weekends working on other people's trucks, because keeping his hands busy was the only thing that quieted the noise in his head. He was good at it too. Had a feel for engines, for metal, for the way parts fit together. Funny thing, when you think about it later, a feel for the exact same kind of work his father was doing in a workshop he knew nothing about. Somewhere in the middle of all that, he married a woman named Lisa, who loved him when he was home and resented him when he wasn't, which, given the nature of the job, meant she resented him about 9 months out of every 12. Lisa wasn't a bad woman. She was a woman who married a sailor, thinking the adventure would be worth the loneliness. And by year 6, she'd learned that military loneliness isn't romantic. It's Tuesday night, with a broken garbage disposal and no one to call. It's birthdays spent on a video connection that freezes every 30 seconds. It's building a life with someone who is physically absent for the majority of it, and emotionally absent for a good portion of the rest. The marriage lasted 11 years. The divorce took 14 months. Lisa kept the house. Marcus kept his truck. They split the savings. When it was done, Marcus had a duffel bag, a bank balance that made him wince, and a medical discharge that came through 6 weeks after the papers were signed, because the Navy decided that the ringing in his ears and the ache in his spine had finally crossed the line from inconvenient to disqualifying. 23 years of service, and he walked out the gate with a handshake, a pension that barely covered rent, and no clear idea of what a man is supposed to do when the only life he knows tells him he's finished. The apartment he rented in Fayetteville was the kind of place that exists solely because someone needs a place to sleep and doesn't care what it looks like. Second floor, thin walls, a window that looked out at the parking lot of a tire shop. Marcus would wake up at Sarah 500 because his body didn't know how to sleep past that. And he'd sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and stare at a phone that never rang. He applied for 3 jobs in the first 2 weeks. Security guard at a warehouse, night shift at a distribution center, maintenance tech at an apartment complex bigger than the one he lived in. He got callbacks on none of them. Not because he wasn't qualified, but because civilian hiring managers don't know what to do with a man whose resume is 23 years of a world they've never seen. They see the gap between military experience and their job listing, and they move on to the next application. He found Gunner 3 weeks into that silence. The shelter was outside of Fayetteville, on a county road between a feed store and a church, the kind of place that runs on volunteers and donations and closes on Mondays. Marcus went because he saw a flyer taped to the window of a gas station, and for reasons he couldn't explain at the time, the photo of a dog on that flyer made him pull over. The dog was sitting in the last kennel on the left, a German shepherd with a scar across his muzzle and eyes that watched everything without blinking. The volunteer said Gunner had been picked up wandering a construction site. No collar, no chip, no owner who came looking. She said he'd been there 4 months. She said folks walked right past him every time, because the scar made him look mean, but he wasn't mean. He was just waiting. Marcus knelt down in front of the kennel, and the dog walked over and pressed his nose against the chain link and just held it there, breathing, like he was taking the measure of the man in front of him. Something passed between them in that moment. Not the kind of thing you can explain to someone who hasn't felt it. The recognition of one creature who's been left behind looking at another. Marcus didn't plan on getting a dog that day. He filled out the paperwork 20 minutes later. On the drive home, Gunner sat in the passenger seat and rested his chin on the center console and sighed, the way a dog sighs when something that was wrong has finally been set right. Marcus drove with one hand and rested the other on the dog's neck, and neither of them moved for the entire ride. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. 6 months after the divorce, 8 weeks after the discharge, Marcus got a phone call from a probate attorney in a town called Harlan. His father, Roy Tanner, was dead, pancreatic cancer. The attorney said it matter-of-factly the way people do when they deliver news about a stranger to another stranger, because that's what Roy was, a stranger. A name, Marcus, associated with absence, not presence. With a door closing, not opening. The attorney asked if Marcus wanted to come collect the estate. Marcus almost laughed, because what a stake could a man like Roy Tanner possibly have? But the attorney said there were a few items, and Marcus figured if nothing else, it would give him a reason to drive somewhere. Because sitting in that apartment in Fayetteville, with nothing to do and nowhere to be, was starting to eat at him in ways he didn't want to name. So he loaded Gunnar into the truck and drove 4 hours to Harlan, which turned out to be the kind of town where the tallest building is the grain elevator and the busiest intersection has a blinking yellow light instead of a red one. The attorney's office was above a hardware store. The attorney himself was a thin man with wire glasses who looked like he'd been practicing law in that same room since before Marcus was born. He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was the key, rusted, heavy, old, and a folded piece of paper with an address written in pencil. That was it. That was the entire estate of Roy Tanner. No property deed. Marcus held the key in his hand and felt its weight and tried to understand what his father meant by leaving him this. If it was a joke, it wasn't funny. If it was a message, he couldn't read it. The attorney said he had no additional information. Roy had come in 14 months earlier, drawn up the simplest will the attorney had ever notarized, and left the envelope sealed with instructions to contact his son upon his death. The attorney said Roy looked thin and tired and was wearing a work shirt with grease on the cuffs, and that was all he remembered. Marcus drove to the bank because the address on the paper was a number he didn't recognize. And he figured maybe it was an account number. Maybe the key was to a safe deposit box. Maybe there was something more to this than a piece of rust in a scrap of paper. That's when the woman behind the counter laughed at him. That's when the manager told him to try a locksmith. That's when Marcus walked out of the bank and sat on the curb next to his dog and wondered, for the first time in a long time, if the world was done with him entirely. Gunnar was the one who changed everything. Not in the dramatic way you see in movies, where the dog barks and runs and leads the hero to the exact right spot at the exact right moment. It was quieter than that. Marcus was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of a gas station on the east side of town, staring at the address on the paper, when Gunnar stood up in the passenger seat and pressed his nose against the window and started whining. Not the whine a dog makes when he wants out, the whine a dog makes when he's caught something, when his attention is locked onto a point in the distance and every muscle in his body is asking permission to go. Marcus looked where Gunnar was looking. Across the road, past a stretch of dead grass and a chain-link fence, there was a row of storage units. The kind of place people rent when they're between houses, or when they have too much stuff and not enough room, or when they need a place to put things they don't want anyone else to find. Marcus looked at the address on the paper, looked at the faded number on the sign above the storage facility's gate. They matched. His hands were steady when he turned the key in the padlock. 23 years of Navy discipline will do that. Keep your hands steady, even when your chest is tight and your mind is running scenarios. The lock resisted, the rust had seized the mechanism, and for a moment Marcus thought the key was going to snap. He worked it back and forth, gentle, patient, the way you coax a bolt that hasn't moved in years. Finally, he felt it give. A quarter turn, a half turn. The shackle popped loose. The door groaned on its track when he pulled it up, and the smell that came out was dust and old metal and something faintly chemical like paint thinner that had evaporated a long time ago. There was no gold inside, no stacks of cash, no obvious treasure of any kind. There was a workbench pushed against the back wall, a pegboard with tools hanging on it, and 5 cardboard boxes stacked neatly in the center of the floor. On top of the boxes sat a metal lockbox, olive green, the kind the military uses for ammunition. And taped to the lid of that lockbox was another key. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking. Gunnar walked past him into the unit and started sniffing the boxes. moving from one to the other with that deliberate, methodical way he had, like he was cataloging everything. Marcus opened the first cardboard box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some in frames, some loose, all of them showing a man Marcus barely recognized. Roy Tanner, younger, thinner, kneeling in front of what looked like a workbench in a different location. In some of the photos, Roy was holding up pieces of metal that had been shaped and welded into something Marcus couldn't identify. In others, he was standing next to another man, older, white-haired, both of them smiling in front of a building Marcus had never seen. Roy's hands in every photo were dark with grease, and the expression on his face was one Marcus had never associated with his father. Satisfaction, purpose, pride in what he was building. The second box held papers. Receipts, mostly, from hardware stores and machine shops going back 15 years. The third box held more tools, specialized ones, the kind you'd use for precision metalwork. The fourth box held rolls of paper tied with string. Marcus untied one and unrolled it across the workbench, and Gunnar came over and sat at his feet and watched him the way he always did, with that steady, patient attention that made Marcus feel like at least one living creature in the world gave a damn about what he was doing. The paper was a blueprint, hand-drawn, meticulous, with measurements noted in Roy's handwriting. It showed some kind of mechanical device Marcus didn't recognize, a valve, or a coupling, or a fitting of some type, with annotations that referenced materials and tolerances, and something called a provisional patent application. And there, in the bottom right corner of the blueprint, written in pencil and circled twice, was a patent number. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because that patent number was real. And the device Roy Tanner had been building in secret for the better part of 2 decades was not a hobby project. It was not the idle tinkering of a man who couldn't hold down a real job. It was an invention, a real one, with a real patent granted by the United States Patent Office. But Marcus didn't know that yet. What he knew, standing in that storage unit with dust on his hands and a dog at his feet, was that his father had been doing something. Something deliberate, something sustained, something that required 15 years of receipts and hand-drawn blueprints and a level of focus that didn't match the story Marcus had been told his entire life. The man who couldn't handle responsibility had apparently been handling quite a lot of it, just not where anyone was watching. Marcus took the second key, the one taped to the ammunition box, and opened the lockbox. Inside were more papers. A lease agreement for a commercial property on the industrial side of Harlan. A stack of correspondence with the patent office, letters going back over a decade, and a third key, smaller than the first 2, brass instead of iron, with a tag attached to it that read workshop in Roy's handwriting. 3 keys, 3 locks, each one leading to the next. And Marcus was starting to understand that his father hadn't just left him a rusted key and a scrap of paper. Roy Tanner had left him a trail. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that came after. Marcus had a cousin, Vernon Tanner, Roy's brother's son, though Vernon always acted more like Roy's brother than his nephew. Vernon had lived in Harlan his whole life, ran a used car lot on the highway, served on the town council, wore pressed shirts and polished boots, and spoke in that slow, careful way that certain men use when they want you to believe they're more important than they are. 3 days after Roy died, Vernon walked into the county courthouse and filed a claim on Roy's estate. Every piece of it, the storage unit, the contents, the lease, anything and everything Roy might have owned at the time of his death. Vernon's argument was simple. Marcus hadn't been around. Marcus hadn't spoken to Roy in decades. Marcus had no relationship with his father, no knowledge of his affairs, and no legitimate claim to anything Roy left behind. Vernon, on the other hand, had been right here in Harlan the whole time. Vernon had checked on Roy when he got sick. Vernon had driven Roy to the hospital in the last weeks. Vernon had earned whatever Roy had, and Marcus had not. The probate judge set a hearing date, 30 days out. Marcus found the workshop on a Tuesday. He drove to the address on the lease agreement, the industrial side of Harlan, where the buildings are cinder block and corrugated metal, and the streets don't have sidewalks. The workshop was at the end of a dead-end road, a squat concrete building with a roll-up door and no sign out front. The brass key fit the padlock on the side entrance. When Marcus stepped inside, Gunnar went in ahead of him, and the dog's nails clicked on the concrete floor in a building that hadn't heard a sound in months. It was a real workshop. Not a storage unit, not a garage, not a corner of someone's basement, a proper shop with a milling machine, a lathe, a drill press, a welding station, and a workbench that ran the entire length of the back wall. Shelves lined with jars of fasteners and bins of raw stock. A ventilation hood over the welding area. Fluorescent lights overhead, the long industrial kind. Roy Tanner had built himself a manufacturing space, a place where a man could take a blueprint and turn it into a physical object, and he'd done it so quietly that nobody in Harlan seemed to know it existed. On the workbench, Marcus found the prototype. A machined metal assembly about the size of a coffee can, with threaded fittings and a valve mechanism that Marcus, even with his limited mechanical knowledge, could tell, had been built with a level of precision that didn't belong in a shop like this. The surfaces were polished, the welds were clean, the threads were cut so fine you could feel the craftsmanship just by running your thumb across them. Next to the prototype was a notebook filled with Roy's handwriting. Page after page of calculations, material, specifications, test results. Roy had been refining this device for years, adjusting tolerances by fractions of a millimeter, testing and retesting, the kind of obsessive iteration that separates tinkerers from engineers. And it was here, in the bottom drawer of that workbench, underneath a stack of trade magazines, that Marcus found the letters. 11 of them, all addressed to him, all sealed, none of them ever mailed. The first letter was dated 12 years ago. Roy's handwriting was steadier then, the lines more confident. He wrote that he wanted Marcus to know why he left, that it wasn't because he didn't love his son, that Helen had given him a choice leave, or she would take Marcus somewhere. Roy would never find them, and Roy, who was not a man built for courtrooms or lawyers or the kind of warfare that happens inside a family, chose to leave because he believed Marcus would be safer and more stable with his mother, that he regretted it every single day, that he started building the device because he needed something to put his hands on, something to pour himself into, something that would prove he was more than the man Helen told their son he was, and that he was building it for Marcus. All of it. The workshop, the patent, the invention, every piece of it was meant to be his son's. The second letter was written 2 years after the first. How he'd found the building, negotiated the lease, spent 3 months installing the electrical and the ventilation before he even set up the first machine. He described the feeling of standing in an empty concrete room and knowing that this was where he'd build something that mattered. He said it was the first time since leaving that he felt like a man instead of a ghost. The third and fourth letters tracked the invention itself. Roy explained what the device was designed to do, in language simple enough that his son, who he knew was a sailor and not an engineer, could follow it. He described the failures: 14 prototypes that didn't work, 2 that almost did. The night he threw a wrench across the shop and sat in the parking lot in his truck for an hour because the threading kept failing under pressure and he couldn't figure out why. He figured it out the next morning before coffee, standing in the shower. He wrote that down too. The fifth letter was the one that hit Marcus the hardest. Roy had tried to find him. Twice. Once through a private investigator who tracked Marcus to his duty station in Norfolk but was turned away at the base gate because Roy didn't have the right paperwork. Once through a letter sent to the last address Roy had for Helen, which came back marked "no longer at this address." Roy wrote that he sat in his truck outside the post office and held that returned letter for a long time. He wrote that there's a particular kind of helplessness reserved for a father who can't reach his own child, and that he wouldn't wish it on anyone, not even Helen. The letters after that were shorter, more practical. Roy described the patent process, the filing, the waiting, the revisions the patent office requested. He described finishing the prototype that finally worked, the one sitting on the workbench 6 feet from where Marcus was now reading about it. He described the companies that reached out after the patent was published. He described turning them down, not because their offers weren't good, but because the patent wasn't his to license. It was Marcus's. Everything was Marcus's. Roy was just keeping it warm. The handwriting was barely legible. Roy said the cancer was moving fast, and that he'd made arrangements. He said the keys would lead where they needed to lead. He said he was sorry. He said, "I know I wasn't there, but I was always building toward you." Marcus sat on the floor of that workshop with the letters spread around him and Gunnar lying across his legs, and he read all 11 of them, one at a time, some of them twice. By the time he finished the last one, the light through the workshop windows had gone from afternoon to dusk. Gunnar hadn't moved the entire time. The dog just lay there with his weight pressed against Marcus's side, warm and steady and present in the way that only a dog can be present, without expectation, without judgment, without needing anything from the moment, except proximity to the person he'd chosen. If Marcus had stopped there, this would be a very different story. But there was one more lock, and Marcus didn't even know about it yet. It was Gunnar who found it. The dog had been nosing around the workshop the way dogs do, investigating every corner, every shadow, every scent that didn't belong. And in the back corner, behind a shelving unit, Gunnar started pawing at the wall. Not casually, deliberately, the way a trained dog alerts. Marcus moved the shelving unit and found a seam in the concrete, a panel set flush with the wall, with a keyhole in the center. Marcus looked at the keys in his hand, the original rusted one, the brass one, the one from the ammunition box. None of them fit. He went back to the workbench, searched the drawers, and found it in a magnetic case stuck to the underside of the bench top. A small steel key, newer than the others, barely any wear on it. This lock Roy had expected to be opened. This lock was the one that mattered. Behind the panel was a fireproof safe, the kind rated for documents. The steel key turned smoothly. Inside were 3 items: a signed last will and testament, notarized and witnessed, a deed to the workshop property, transferring ownership to Marcus Dean Tanner upon Roy's death, and a sealed envelope with Marcus's name written on the front in handwriting that was shakier now, the letters pressed hard into the paper like the man writing them was fighting to keep his hands steady. Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "If you're reading this, the keys worked. I'm sorry I couldn't hand them to you myself. Everything in this building is yours. The patent is real, and it is yours. The workshop is yours. I built it for you, all of it, every piece. because I couldn't be your father, so I tried to be something else. I tried to be the man who left you something worth having. There is a man named Frank Calloway in Knoxville. He has a copy of this will, and he can verify everything. Your mother told you I was nothing. I hope this building tells you something different. Love, Roy. Now, if you're watching this and you've been wondering when things get complicated, this is where the story stops being about keys and starts being about a fight. If you've been watching this far and this story has earned a few minutes of your time, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, about men and their dogs, and the things we find when we stop running and start looking, that's what this channel is about. So, Marcus had the will, he had the deed. He had a workshop full of evidence that Roy Tanner spent 15 years building something real, something with a granted patent, something meant for his son. You'd think that would settle it. You'd think a man could walk into a probate hearing with a notarized will, a deed, and a paper trail a mile long, and walk out with what his father left him. But Vernon Tanner was not the kind of man who let things go easily. What Vernon did next made everything Marcus had been through look tame by comparison. Vernon hired a lawyer from Lexington, not a Harlan lawyer, not someone who owed favors to the local bar or went to church with a probate judge. A Lexington attorney who specialized in estate disputes and charged $400 an hour and wore suits that cost more than Marcus's truck. And that attorney filed a motion to dismiss Roy's will on 2 grounds. First, that Roy Tanner was mentally unfit at the time the will was executed, owing to his illness and isolation. Second, that the will itself was a forgery, fabricated by Marcus or someone acting on his behalf, designed to seize assets that rightfully belonged to the broader Tanner family. The accusation hit Marcus like a boot to the chest. He had driven 4 hours to collect a rusted key from a dead man he hadn't spoken to in 30 years, and now he was being accused of forging that dead man's will to steal property he didn't even know existed until 2 weeks ago. The probate judge, a careful woman named Patterson, allowed the motion and moved the hearing up by 10 days. Marcus had no lawyer. He had a truck with 160,000 miles on it, a dog, and a stack of letters from a father who died before they could have the conversation that might have changed everything. This is the part of the story where someone showed up, who didn't have to. Her name was Claire Dawson, and she was 26 years old, and she worked at the same bank that had laughed Marcus out the door. She wasn't the woman behind the counter that day. She was the one sitting 3 desks back, the one who processed wire transfers and helped old ladies reset their online banking passwords. She had overheard the whole thing. She heard the laughter. She saw Marcus walk out. And something about it bothered her, the way cruelty dressed up as professionalism always bothers the people who have to watch it happen and can't say anything because they need the job. Claire found Marcus at the workshop 2 days later. She'd looked up the address from the lease filing, which was public record at the county clerk's office, and she'd driven out there on her lunch break. She told Marcus she believed him. She didn't know why, exactly, except that the man she saw in the bank didn't look like a man running a con. He looked like a man holding on to the only thing he had left. And she said that if there was a paper trail, she could help him find it. Because tracing financial records was literally what she did for a living, and she was good at it. Over the next 9 days, Claire and Marcus pieced together the full scope of what Roy Tanner had built. Claire found the patent filing records, and what she discovered stopped them both cold. The patent hadn't just been filed. It had been granted, approved, and assigned a number by the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The device Roy built was a specialized pressure relief valve designed for use in industrial piping systems, and 3 companies had already inquired about licensing it before Roy got too sick to respond. The patent? Significant commercial value. The kind of value that turns a probate dispute between family members into something much more aggressive. And Vernon knew. Marcus was sure of it now. Vernon had been checking on Roy in his final months, which meant Vernon had been inside the house, maybe inside the workshop, close enough to see what Roy was building, close enough to understand that the old man everyone dismissed as a tinkerer. That's why Vernon filed his claim 3 days after the funeral. Not out of grief, not out of family loyalty, because he knew what was in that workshop, and he wanted it. The hearing was in 6 days. Claire traced the notary who witnessed Roy's will. The notary confirmed. The signature confirmed the date, confirmed that Roy Tanner appeared in her office of his own free will and sound mind, thin and tired but lucid and deliberate, and that he stated clearly, and without prompting, that he wished to leave everything to his son. That was one piece. But Marcus needed more, because Vernon's lawyer was good, and a good lawyer can make a notary's memory sound unreliable under cross-examination. A good lawyer can suggest that a dying man's lucidity is a matter of interpretation. A good lawyer can plant just enough doubt to make a judge hesitate. That's when Marcus remembered the name from his father's letter. Frank Calloway, Knoxville. Marcus drove to Knoxville on a Thursday, gunner riding shotgun, 4 hours through the mountains with the windows cracked and the radio off. He found Frank Calloway living in a small brick house on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood that looked like it hadn't changed since 1975. There was a mailbox out front with the name hand-painted in white, and a porch with 2 chairs on it. The kind of porch where a man sits and watches the street because he's waiting for someone specific to come walking up it. Frank was 73 years old, retired from a career in industrial supply that had taken him all over the Southeast, and he had been waiting for Marcus Tanner to knock on his door for over a year. He said he'd been expecting it since the day Roy told him about the keys. Frank opened the door and looked at Marcus for a long moment. And his eyes got wet, and he said, "You look just like him. Same shoulders, same jaw. He always said you would." He looked down at Gunner, standing at Marcus's side, and smiled. "He told me about the dog, too. Said if his boy was anything like him, there'd be a dog." Then he stepped aside and invited them in. Frank and Roy had served together. Not in the Navy, like Marcus, but in the Army. Decades earlier, a 2-year stint that forged the kind of bond that doesn't break even when men go separate ways and live separate lives. They'd been stationed at Fort Campbell, shared a barracks room for 14 months, and spent their weekends rebuilding a 1968 Ford Falcon that belonged to their platoon sergeant. Frank said Roy was the best mechanic he'd ever seen. Not trained, just born with the kind of hands that understood how things fit together. Frank said he told Roy 100 times that he should go to engineering school, and Roy would just shake his head and say he didn't need a school to teach him what his hands already knew. After the Army, they'd gone different directions, but they stayed in touch. Christmas cards that turned into phone calls, that turned into visits every couple of years. Frank was the one Roy called when he found the building for the workshop. Frank drove down from Knoxville and helped Roy install the electrical panel and the ventilation system over a long weekend. Frank was the one Roy called when the patent was approved, and Frank said the sound in Roy's voice that day was something he'd never heard before joy, but the cautious kind. The kind that comes when you've been working toward something for so long that you're almost afraid to celebrate it because you don't trust the world not to take it back. Frank had witnessed the will separately from the notary because Roy wanted a backup, a fail-safe, a second copy held by someone he trusted in case anything went wrong. Roy was a careful man. Roy was the kind of man who built redundancy into everything he made, including his last wishes. He told Frank that Vernon had been sniffing around the workshop, asking questions about what Roy was working on, showing up unannounced with a six-pack and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Roy didn't trust Vernon. Roy didn't trust anyone in Harlan, really, except the notary and the attorney. But he trusted Frank. He trusted Frank since Fort Campbell. Frank had a copy of the will, signed, witnessed, dated. He also had something else, a video recording, made on a phone, of Roy sitting in his workshop speaking directly into the camera, stating his name, the date, and his intention to leave everything to his son Marcus. Roy's voice in the recording was thin but steady. His eyes were clear. He held up the will and read the key passages aloud, and at the end he looked into the camera and said, "I know you probably have questions. I'm sorry, I won't be there to answer them, but I hope the keys were enough." Marcus watched that video sitting in Frank Calloway's living room with Gunnar. Lying on the carpet beside him, he watched it 3 times. The first time, he watched his father's face. The second time, he listened to the words. The third time, he watched Roy's hands. The way they held the paper, steady despite the sickness, deliberate despite the exhaustion. And he saw his own hands in them, the same way of gripping something like you mean to hold it for good. Frank drove back to Harlan with Marcus the next morning. He wasn't going to let him face that courtroom alone. The hearing was held on a Monday in a courtroom on the second floor of the county building that smelled like floor polish and old wood. The room was small. Wood paneling on the walls, fluorescent lights overhead, an American flag in the corner. Vernon sat on one side with his Lexington attorney, a man in a charcoal suit who kept a leather portfolio open in front of him and made notes with a pen that probably cost more than Marcus's boots. Vernon was wearing his pressed shirt and his polished shoes, and he looked like a man who expected to win because he always had. Marcus sat on the other side with Claire, who was not a lawyer, but who had organized every document, every receipt, every letter, every patent filing, every piece of evidence into a binder so clean and so thorough that the probate judge spent 40 minutes going through it page by page without asking a single question. Claire had tabbed each section with colored flags. She had cross-referenced the dates on the patent filings with the dates on the lease payments, with the dates on Roy's letters. The paper trail didn't just tell a story. It told the story in chronological order, with receipts. Frank Calloway sat in the gallery, and when he was called to testify, he walked to the front of the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had been carrying a promise for a long time and was finally being allowed to keep it. He wore a clean button-down shirt and his Army service pin on his collar. And when the judge asked him to state his relationship to the deceased, he said, "Roy Tanner was the best friend I ever had, Your Honor. And I'm here because he asked me to be." Frank presented the second copy of the will. He presented the video. He testified that Roy Tanner was of sound mind, that Roy had planned this inheritance carefully and deliberately, and that Roy's explicit and repeated wish was that everything he built would go to his son. He described the years of work. He described a man who woke up every morning and drove to a concrete building at the end of a dead-end road and worked alone for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time because he was building something for someone who didn't know he existed anymore. Vernon's attorney tried to push back. He questioned the video's authenticity. He questioned Frank's objectivity. He suggested that Frank and Roy might have conspired to create a false document designed to cut the rest of the Tanner family out of an inheritance they were entitled to. He was smooth about it, too. the way expensive lawyers are. He didn't accuse. He implied. He planted seeds and let them sit. But the notary's records matched. The dates matched. The signatures matched. The video showed a man who was sick but clear-eyed, speaking in complete sentences, holding up the same document that was now sitting on the judge's desk. And when the attorney tried to suggest that Roy might have been coerced, Frank Calloway looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Sir, I knew Roy Tanner for 51 years. Nobody coerced that man into anything. He was the most stubborn human being I have ever met, and I say that with love." The courtroom was quiet after that. The kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone in it knows that the right thing and the legal thing are about to line up, and they're just waiting for someone with a gavel to make it official. Judge Patterson ruled in Marcus's favor. The will was valid. The deed was enforceable. The workshop, its contents, the patent, and all associated rights were the sole property of Marcus Dean Tanner. Vernon's claim was dismissed. His motion to declare the will a forgery was denied. The judge noted, in language that was polite but carried a blade inside it, that the evidence presented by the claimant was insufficient, and that the evidence presented by the heir was, in her words, comprehensive and compelling. Vernon's face went tight. His jaw worked, and his hands gripped the edge of the table. And for a moment, Marcus thought he might say something. He didn't. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of that courtroom without looking at Marcus, without looking at Frank, without looking at anyone. He walked across the parking lot, got in his truck, and drove away. And Marcus never saw him at the workshop or the storage unit or anywhere near Roy's property again. Marcus reopened the workshop on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the hearing. He didn't rush it. He spent the first few days just sitting in there, reading Roy's notebooks, studying the blueprints, running his hands over the prototype and trying to understand what his father had been chasing all those years. The device was close to finished. Roy had gotten it maybe 90% of the way there before his body gave out. The last entries in the notebook were shaky, the handwriting deteriorating as the cancer advanced, but the notes were still precise. Roy had known exactly what needed to be done to finish it. He just ran out of time. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a machinist. He was a Navy veteran with steady hands and a willingness to learn. And he had a shop full of tools and a notebook full of instructions written by a man who wanted his son to be able to pick up where he left off. The first week he just studied, read every page of the notebook, traced every line of the blueprints with his finger, handled the prototype, turning it over and over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, learning its geometry the way his father must have learned it, through touch and patience and repetition. The second week, Roy's notes walked him through the process in steps that were almost conversational, as if Roy had written them, knowing that the person reading them would need more than measurement. He'd written things like, "The first cut is always the scariest. Take it slow. The metal will tell you if you're going too fast. And if the threading chatter sounds wrong, stop. Walk away. Come back with fresh ears." It was like having a conversation with a man who wasn't there anymore but had left his voice behind in the margins. Marcus made mistakes. He ruined 2 pieces of stock trying to cut threads he'd never cut before. He burned through a welding rod on a joint that should have taken half the material. One night, around 11 o'clock, he botched a bore so badly that the whole piece warped, and he sat on the concrete floor with his back against the workbench and stared at the ceiling and thought about quitting. Gunnar walked over and laid his head on Marcus's knee and sighed, and Marcus looked at that dog and said, "Your father would have gotten it right the first time." Gunnar just blinked at him. Marcus got up and started over. That was the rhythm of those weeks. Failure, frustration, persistence. A cycle that any veteran understands because the military teaches you one thing above all others. And it's not courage or discipline or chain of command. It's that you don't stop because it's hard. You stop when it's done. Gunnar was there for every hour of it. The dog would lie on a blanket Marcus put down next to the workbench, and he'd watch Marcus work the way he watched everything, with that steady, unblinking attention that never wavered, never judged, never asked for anything more than proximity. Some nights, Marcus would work until 2 in the morning, and Gunnar would still be on that blanket, awake, ears tracking the sound of the lathe, the grinder, the tap of Marcus's hammer on a stubborn fitting. When Marcus finally killed the lights and walked to the truck, Gunnar would stretch, shake himself off, and follow. And they'd drive back to the motel in silence. Two creatures who had found their purpose in the same room. When Marcus took breaks during the day, he'd sit on the floor next to Gunnar and drink coffee and look around the shop and think about his father standing in this same spot, doing this same work, building something for a son he couldn't reach. He'd look at the pegboard with Roy's tools hanging exactly where Roy had placed them. He'd look at the coffee mug on the shelf by the door, still sitting there after all these months, a ring of dried coffee in the bottom, Roy's mug. Roy's shop, Roy's dream, passed down through a chain of rusted keys to a son who almost never found it. Claire stopped by most evenings after the bank closed. She'd bring food, sometimes, or just sit on the stool by the door and talk while Marcus worked. Their conversations were easy in a way. Marcus wasn't used to. Claire asked questions about the Navy, about Gunnar, about the blueprints, and she listened to the answers with a kind of focused attention that reminded Marcus, in a way that made his chest tight, of the way Gunnar listened. Present. Interested. Not waiting for her turn to talk, she was the one who contacted the 3 companies that had inquired about the patent. 2 of them were still interested. One of them sent an engineer to inspect the prototype, and the engineer spent an hour examining Roy's work and said, without qualification, that it was one of the cleanest mechanical solutions he had seen in 20 years in the industry. He said whoever built this understood fluid dynamics at an intuitive level that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Marcus almost said, "That was my father." Instead, he just nodded because his throat was too tight to speak. The licensing conversation started the following week. It took Marcus 2 months to finish the device. 63 days from the first tentative cut on the lathe to the final polishing pass on the housing. The final version matched Roy's blueprints down to the last tolerance, the last thread, the last surface finish. He set it on the workbench under the fluorescent lights and stood back and looked at it. It was late past midnight. The only sound in the shop was the hum of the fluorescent tubes and Gunnar's breathing. Marcus looked at the finished device and felt something settle in his chest, a weight lifting and another weight arriving at the same time. The grief of finishing something a dead man started, and the pride of knowing he finished it well. Gunnar stood up from his blanket and walked over and sniffed the device before looking up at Marcus. The way he always did, like whatever Marcus decided to do next was fine with him. That was the moment. Not the courtroom, not the hearing, not the will, or the deed, or the patent. The moment was a man standing in his father's workshop past midnight, looking at a finished piece of work with a dog beside him, who had been there through every locked door and every rusted key and every room full of dust and memory. That was the moment Marcus understood what Roy had been trying to tell him. You are not what they said you were. And neither was I. The rusted key hangs on a chain around Marcus's neck now. He wears it under his shirt, against his chest, where he can feel the weight of it. It doesn't open anything anymore. All the locks it was meant for have been opened. Every door walked through. Every secret brought into the light. But Marcus keeps it because it reminds him of the morning he walked into a bank and got laughed at by a woman who saw a man holding a worthless piece of rust and never once considered that worthless things can open doors that lead to places worth more than anything she's ever counted. The workshop is open. The patent is licensed. The invention Roy Tanner spent 15 years building is out in the world now, doing exactly what he designed it to do, carrying his name on the filing and his son's name on the business. And every morning when Marcus unlocks the shop and flips on the lights, and Gunnar walks in ahead of him and settles onto his blanket by the workbench, Marcus thinks about a trail of keys left by a man who couldn't say what he needed to say in person. So he said it in metal and paper and locked doors, one after another, a chain of breadcrumbs leading from a storage unit on the edge of town to a workshop at the end of a dead-end road, to a safe behind a wall, to a letter that said simply, "The woman at the bank doesn't laugh anymore. She doesn't say much of anything when Marcus walks in these days. She processes his deposits and hands him his receipts and calls him sir, and Marcus thanks her and walks out and drives back to the shop where Gunnar is waiting, because there's work to do." And for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Tanner knows exactly what that work is and exactly who he's doing it for. The same person his father was doing it for. The next one in line, the one who follows the keys,